On the ground, it leaked. Fuel dripped from its seams onto the runway. In the air, it sealed itself. That aircraft was real, and it was tested at Groom Lake. To understand how something like that existed, you have to understand how it was hidden. Technology like that doesn't survive out in the open. It survives inside a stronghold. In 1955, the CIA needed a place that did not yet exist, a place designed for absolute secrecy. The Cold War was intensifying. Intelligence gathering had become a strategic weapon. Spies were everywhere. Traditional airfields were exposed, visible from highways, vulnerable to observation, impossible to fortify at the level required. What was needed was a location that could not be observed, approached, or penetrated, because what was coming next would have to fly higher than radar, be faster than missiles, and remain invisible while doing it. At the time, it was nothing more than a dry lake bed connected to the Nevada test site, empty desert already under federal control. But what made Groom Lake valuable was not isolation. It was total containment. The surrounding airspace was sealed into a permanent square of restricted sky, designated R4808N, a block that still exists today and remains one of the most restricted pieces of airspace on Earth. No civilian overflight, no deviation, no exceptions. On the ground, approach roads were monitored miles before the perimeter. Cameras tracked movement long before a vehicle came into view. Motion sensors and pressure-triggered detection systems registered disturbances across the desert floor. Tripwires were laid across remote access routes, silent triggers designed to alert security to direction and speed of travel long before anyone reached the gate. Patrol units operated beyond sight lines. After 9/11, security tightened even further. Groom Lake was no longer remote land. It became engineered exclusion, a controlled zone where nothing entered without being logged and nothing left without authorization. Not a vehicle, not a person, not even a jackrabbit or a coyote crossing the desert floor. Groom Lake became the place where ideas were forced into reality inside an impenetrable system designed to eliminate exposure. If the idea failed, no one would ever know. If it succeeded, no one would know that either. From the beginning, secrecy was not an accessory. It was the operating principle. Aircraft were assembled here, tested here, flown here, pushed beyond their limits, far from public view, and far from foreign observers. Nothing about Groom Lake was casual. Everything was deliberate. Everything had a purpose. And then, in October 1957, the skies as we had known them for millennia had been breached. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik. For the first time, an object built by an adversary passed overhead in predictable orbit. Not a bomber, not a reconnaissance plane, a satellite. The United States could control roads, it could control airspace, it could control maritime ports and sea lanes, but it could not control high-altitude orbit. From that moment on, secrecy had to evolve. It had to. Groom Lake was no longer remote. It was exposed from above. Test schedules on the ground were timed to orbital passes. Aircraft were moved under cover before Soviet satellites crossed overhead, because satellites didn't just take photographs. They measured heat. When a prototype aircraft sat on the runway under the desert sun, it blocked sunlight. The sand under it stayed cooler than everything around it. Even after the aircraft was pulled away and hidden, that cooler patch on the ground remained for a time. From space, that difference in temperature showed up. A shadow shaped like the aircraft. A thermal outline burned into the desert floor. The aircraft could be hidden. The shadow, shaped like the prototype, could not. From orbit, they could study its silhouette. They could begin to understand what it looked like. Groom Lake was no longer a stronghold. It was a chessboard. The first move on that chessboard was Project Aquatone. The CIA needed an aircraft that could fly above 70,000 feet, higher than Soviet radar coverage was believed to reach, beyond the ceiling of interceptor aircraft, beyond the grasp of early surface-to-air missiles. Existing jets were too low, too loud, and too visible. The answer was the U-2, a reconnaissance aircraft built less like a fighter and more like a glider with a jet engine strapped to it. Long, fragile wings, enormous span, built to climb into air so thin it could barely stay aloft. Groom Lake became the only place it could be tested without being seen. Pilots called it flying on the edge of a coffin corner, where a few knots too slow meant stall and fall out of the sky, and a few knots too fast meant structural failure. This is where theory met atmosphere, and it worked. At the time, international law had never clearly defined where sovereign airspace ended and outer space began. Most aircraft couldn't fly high enough for the question to matter. The U-2 changed that. It crossed borders not by asking permission, but by operating in a space no one had yet agreed who owned. From an altitude no one had prepared for, it photographed nuclear facilities, missile fields, and cities that officially didn't exist. For years it worked, until 1960. A U-2 was shot down over the Soviet Union. The pilot was captured. The aircraft didn't disappear, it was displayed. Washington called it a weather mission. Moscow rolled out the wreckage. The lie collapsed in full view of the world, and the illusion of invisibility shattered. So, the United States did what it always does when exposed. It went higher. It went faster. It went unseen. The program that followed was called Project Oxcart. By February 12, 1962, Groom Lake was officially designated to test a new aircraft, the A-12. Like the U-2, it wasn't built for fight. It was built to see. But this time, seeing wasn't enough. It had to fly higher, faster, beyond reach. The A-12 could operate at 90,000 feet, more than 17 miles above the Earth, and exceed Mach 3, over 3 times the speed of sound. It wasn't designed to evade missiles. It was designed to outrun them. At those speeds, heat became the enemy. Air friction at Mach 3 generated temperatures hot enough to warp aluminum and weaken conventional alloys. Engineers compared it to rubbing your hands together, except at thousands of miles per hour. And here's what most people don't know. On the ground, the aircraft leaked fuel. Panels didn't seal tightly. Gaps were visible along the fuselage. Mechanics watched it drip onto the runway. However, when flying at Mach 3, the airframe expanded. The metal grew under extreme heat. The gaps actually sealed. In flight, the aircraft literally reshaped itself. In the air, it became whole. To survive that environment, the A-12 had to be built from titanium, a rare and expensive metal the United States didn't have in sufficient quantity at the time. So the CIA did something almost absurd, but brilliant. Through layers of front companies, it quietly purchased titanium from the Soviet Union itself, the very nation the aircraft was being built to spy on. The Soviets were selling strategic material without realizing where it would ultimately end up. The advert unknowingly supplied the spy. Nothing about this program was normal. Aircraft weren't called aircraft, they were called articles. Pilots weren't pilots, they were drivers. Real names were never used. Identities were sometimes drawn from European gravestones, forgotten names stepping back into the world to shield the living. Secrecy wasn't a policy, it was the environment. It was mandatory, and Groom Lake was the system that made it possible. Up to this point, aviation makes sense. Wings evolve, propellers give way to jets, jets break the sound barrier, the U-2 climbs higher, the A-12 outruns missiles. That's progression, that's engineering, that's expected. But not every change was a refinement. Some were not natural steps forward. They were leaps, and some of those leaps felt unnatural. In the early 1940s, aircraft followed a stable formula: body, wings, tail. Then Jack Northrop removed the body. A flying wing. No traditional fuselage, no vertical stabilizer, no tail to steady it, at a time when computers didn't exist to keep it stable. It flew anyway. The YB-35 flew. The YB-49 flew. Then the program vanished. Discontinued. Officially, instability. Unofficially, silence. But the idea didn't disappear. Decades later, the B-2 spirit would emerge, a flying wing reborn as stealth doctrine, not an experiment. Because this was not a tweak, it was a redesign of flight itself. Now pause the timeline. Mid-1940s, Allied pilots reporting luminous spheres pacing bombers. Foo Fighters. Germany experimenting with unconventional airframes and circular prototypes. 1947, Roswell. Through the late 40s and 50s, a surge of unidentified aerial sightings. The flying wing appears in the middle of that atmosphere. Coincidence? Possibly, but the timing is difficult to ignore. Then another leap, the XB-70 Valkyrie. 6 engines, Mach 3 sustained flight, a bomber meant to live at the edge of physics. From breaking the sound barrier to cruising at 3 times it in barely a decade? That's not a smooth curve. That's acceleration. Where did the design confidence come from to leap that far and that fast? And who decides that leap is safe? Cold War urgency explains the need for greater speed. It doesn't explain geometry. It doesn't explain philosophy shifts. It doesn't cause flight to reinvent itself overnight. And it doesn't rewrite the rules of the sky. Those kinds of changes don't come from incremental thinking. They don't emerge from careful steps forward. They come from somewhere. And this is where the temperature changes. Because decades later, a man named Bob Lazar would step forward and claim that some of the leaps tested near Groom Lake did not originate on drafting tables at all. He claimed the technology was reverse engineered, not developed, reverse engineered, from craft that did not originate here. That claim has never been verified, it's never been confirmed, but it has never fully disappeared either. And when you line up the timing, flying wings, Mach 3 titanium, stealth geometry, unidentified sightings in the same era, the question doesn't go away. Were these simply brilliant human breakthroughs? Or were some of the leaps helped? We're not concluding, we're observing. And Groom Lake sits beneath all of it, testing, proving, absorbing ideas that seem to arrive ahead of their time. For years, the facility wasn't called Area 51. That label came from a grid reference on Atomic Energy Commission maps, a square on a Nevada test site survey. Area 51. A bureaucratic designation, nothing more, a number. Not a myth, not a code for aliens, just a numbered block on a Cold War map. But names matter, and because once the number leaked into public consciousness, it stopped being a grid coordinate and started becoming a symbol. Groom Lake became Area 51, and Area 51 became something else. A placeholder for secrets the public knew existed but could not see. A site officially denied for decades. A location the government insisted did not exist until it quietly acknowledged it in 2013. Not because the mythology was confirmed, but because the aircraft programs could no longer be denied. The name survived, and the question survived with it. Groom Lake was built as a stronghold to contain secrets. It tested aircraft that outran missiles. It engineered materials that sealed themselves at speed. It fought a silent war against satellites in orbit. Some advances were evolutionary. Some were unnatural leaps. And whether those leaps came from brilliant engineers pushing physics to its limit, or from ideas seated somewhere else in the cosmos, is a question that has never been answered satisfactorily. Area 51 is not a punchline. It's a stronghold. And strongholds exist for one reason: to guard something. Groom Lake wasn't only one node in that system. Helendale, Dugway, Tonopah, other test ranges, other programs, other stories. And we're just getting started. Some of what happened here is documented. Some of it has been declassified, and some of it is still officially denied. But the pattern is real. Secrecy, a leap, then silence. Secrecy, another leap, then silence. From the U-2 to the rumored Aurora, to whatever flies tomorrow, Groom Lake remains the place where new aircraft are tested against the sky. And if another unnatural leap is coming, it won't appear first in Washington. It won't debut in public. It will land at Groom Lake. Stay with me.